Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host Michael Howard, the head of marketing at Infotools. Today we're joined by Lauren Cheatham, a behavioral scientist and principal quantitative researcher leading creator and engine research at Roblox. She received her PhD in consumer behavior at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and also has a bachelor's and master's degree from Northwestern University. Prior to Roblox, Lauren was a quantitative researcher at both Instagram and Apple and spent a couple of years as a professor of marketing at the University of Hawaii's Shidler College of Business. She started her career as a professional equestrian, obviously, and also has a love for rock climbing as well, as I've just found out. Welcome to the show, Lauren.
Thanks so much. Really excited to be here.
Thanks. So we'll start as we like to on this podcast with the most significant thing that you wanted to share with us today.
I really wanted to share just talking about the process of getting stakeholder buy-in, especially when it comes to research and getting an organization to invest in and believe in research more generally. I wanted to talk about this because I do quite a bit of guest speaking and conference talks and find that people are really hungry to figure out how to get cross-functional partners and large organizations on the side of research. And I'm following my nose on that one, and the fact that it seems like is a pretty critical concern and issue for many people in the field of research.
No, absolutely. And there's a lot of ways that this conversation could go. So I'm looking forward to it. Perhaps for our listeners, we could start with what drew you to the world of market research, just to give us some background on this conversation.
Sure. So if you give me a little license here, the story starts, I was a professional equestrian. So I went to undergrad at Northwestern and have a degree in communications and American history, which obviously leads directly into riding horses for a living.
Yep.
Very normal path that everybody takes. I spent most of my 20s as, buying, selling, training horses, competing, etc. And coming into the end of my 20s, I had a series of back-to-back concussions that made it clear that perhaps this wasn't the best path forward. Anybody who's been around horses probably knows that they are large. They're also afraid of their own shadows. So I have been thrown into walls, floors, ground, fences, kicked, stomped on the whole gamut. And it was I don't know, maybe this doesn't have longevity in terms of a career. So I started thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I've always been super passionate about product. I love product. I love brands. I am definitely the person who's going to talk your ear off about like the right ski jacket, the right layering system, regardless of whether or not you have asked me for that information. I just get really, really passionate about product. And I thought, well, what would make sense for me to do given my background and given my interest? And I thought, well, marketing, telling the story of product and selling product, seems like it would be really fun, right? Like maybe I could go and work in the marketing department at Patagonia and live my best life in Ventura, California. That was kind of the orientation. So I went back to Northwestern to get a master's degree in integrated marketing and communication. And while I was there, I discovered research. So it's not like a passion that started when I was 12. I wasn't aware of the discipline, quite honestly. I was thinking much more from a PR comms or like traditional marketing storytelling orientation. And much to my own chagrin, I fell in love with research. And why I say much to my own chagrin is that it was really hard for me. Statistics were very challenging, like so many tears shed in those classes, we're like in the middle of exams sort of struggle. And so I did what everybody else would do in that position and thought maybe I should make a living out of this. This is so challenging for me. Surely I could find a way to really dive in. And in that time, realized that this was something you can get a PhD in. I really fell in love with deep, deep research, um, and decided to spend a year being a research assistant at Kellogg at the business school, with a series of marketing professors, learning what really academic level research looks like in marketing, and then applied to PhD programs and had the good fortune of getting into Stanford, where I spent several more years crying through stats classes. But it was one of those things that for me, I'd spent my 20s kind of pushing myself to my physical limits, and I was excited to spend essentially much of my 30s pushing my intellectual limits. And marketing research really kind of hit my passion and interest in people's decision making and purchasing behaviors and why we do the things we do, why we buy the things we buy, with this kind of desire to really push my brain like to the limits in terms of from an intellectual perspective. And I feel like I stumbled into it, and turns out I just really love looking at numbers and understanding behaviors at scale. I feel like how cool, how cool that we can understand and help shape how people think, buy, and do, um, ultimately through math. Super nerdy. That's kind of how I came into it, and here I am.
Nice. So, if organizations are the horse, market research is the shadow.
Exactly.
Um, why do you think the skepticism for market research exists within organizations? Possibly
Yeah.
from your own experience you've seen?
Yeah. So, I think it can come from a number of different things. One of which is when we're looking at research, I think, especially, I've been in tech. I was at Apple, I was at Instagram, now at Roblox. Data science is obviously, a critical part of the organization. And I think a lot of times research outside of data science isn't seen as perhaps as rigorous. And I think that's often due to the fact that it often isn't, right? And so I think that obviously breeds quite a bit of skepticism. I also think, uh, I've been very engaged in, UX research as well as, customer experience research, as well as market research. At Roblox, I do all of it. And it's often something I think that, it's like you send it off to a vendor to do it. It's like, or it's the orientation of like, what are you just asking some questions, right? You're just like putting some questions, into a system, and anybody can ask questions. I'm not sure why it is that we need somebody with specialized expertise. I know how to ask a question. You know how to ask a question. We're all normal people who can ask questions. And so I think a lot of it is helping people understand that like you are a normal person, you can ask questions, you are very good at conversation, but in order to be able to understand and get the information that you need out of your user population, you do actually have to have some unique expertise. And on top of that, on the back end, can you do that at scale and then, run really thoughtful, rigorous statistics, to deeply understand your user population? Or, in the case, obviously, a lot of times there's qualitative work. The utmost respect for qualitative work. That's you can't get the depth, right? Like data science isn't going to get you the depth. Talking to, your neighbor's sister's cousin is not going to get you the depth. Nor is it going to get you that large scale understanding. And I think there's just kind of an orientation of like, I can do that. Kind of the way that some people are like, some people can look at, Picasso's work later in life and be like, I could do that. And you're like, well, I don't think you could.
No.
But it is kind of convincing people that there is art and science in research, and then showing like when walk into a room, what value it is you're bringing, what additional insight beyond anything that anybody would expect actually is.
It's also really hard to A/B test that as well, isn't it? So like well-crafted survey design compared to what the person sitting next door to you can produce.
Yep. Yeah. And I think everybody is myopic. I'm myopic. We're all myopic, right? We're kind of like, this is my experience, right? How many times have I been in rooms, even when I was a professor and students would question me this way of like, I'd say, on average, people are more likely to do X given Y. And they'd say like, but I wouldn't. And I'm like, yes, on average. That doesn't mean 100% of people would do this. It
Mm.
means that on average, people would do this. Or, it's like, I think having people really understand that is surprisingly challenging. I've been surprised over the course of my career how often I have to have honest conversations about the difference between correlation and causation. Um, which for those of us in the business, it's like, yeah, like everybody, we all understand it, but it's not actually that simple of a concept, right? And how many times I've been in situations, not necessarily at Roblox, but just in my life, where people are looking at a graph on the left and a graph on the right, and they look vaguely similar in terms of their trend, and they're like, aha, they are related. And you're like, ooh, you can't say that.
No.
You can't look at two graphs of unrelated things and just say they must be related to each other. Ah, one must cause the other. And it's actually quite surprising to me how many rooms I have been in with very smart people where that is the conversation. And so I think there are a lot of reasons why there are barriers to trusting, believing, and fully incorporating market research or UX research into brands, product development life cycle. But I think a lot of it comes down to knowledge about what it is that we do and what it is that we provide.
Hmm. Do you think, is this something across all industries, or do you think it might be something that tech companies that are really familiar with analytics are sort of prone to?
That's a good question. I've never been anywhere other than tech.
Yeah.
Other than the horse business, which is not prone to analytics, it's a very different kind of energy over there. So I can't say for certain because of my lack of experience outside of tech. The thing that drew me to tech, there are a number of different things, but one of them is that there is so much data, right?
Yeah.
There is so much data to dive into and engage with. And before I ever even run a survey or take on a research project, I call myself data scientist light. I'm not proud of my SQL queries, but they get the job done, sort of thing. But if you know SQL well, you probably would look at them and think, gosh, those are deeply inefficient and very ugly to look at, right? So, but I am capable of doing that and then running my own analyses to understand like what do we know today,
Yeah.
um, and this day and age, there's to some extent, I imagine like everybody's a little bit of a tech firm, right? Like everybody has more data than they've ever had before. Um, so I can't necessarily speak. I do think that in non-tech industries, you see a lot more um, research that's more qualitative in nature, smaller scale, because that's quite honestly just easier to conduct, right? And easier to navigate. But yeah, I guess I can only speak to tech.
For sure.
And it's different in each company, right? Like some organizations are like, research is, has always been a critical part of the entire product development life cycle. Where it's not embedded within design or within product. It's its own function.
Mhm.
But that's pretty rare. That's pretty
Yeah.
rare, right? To kind of have that sort of situation. So I do think in some ways, we're somewhat nascent, right? We're not a field that has existed with a lot of rigor for a really long time. So I think there's still a lot of room for growth and opportunity, and expansion of the kind of work that people like us do, that I think is not necessarily the same in other places.
That's right. I mean, market researchers have always operated in uncertainty, and it's our job to provide understanding for our stakeholders, etc. So, I mean, with that in mind, why do you think research often feels like such a hard sell, particularly to company leaders?
I think, well, a lot of it has to do with scale, right? They're like, and certainly this is my situation in coming into a number of organizations and teams that I have come into over my career, where it's like you talk to 20 people, why should I believe you? Why is this the truth, right? And so that can be obviously incredibly challenging, right? Like, how do you explain? And it's really hard for people to understand that, like, listen, you talk to 20 or 50 individuals that use the product, you'll probably have themes converge pretty quickly, and you can feel pretty confident in those findings, even without having it at mass scale. What I've been able to do is come in and say, well, let's get it at scale. So that way you can feel more confident in what it is you're finding. But you've got another layer here, right? Which is like, I can get it for you at scale potentially, but am I actually speaking to the right individuals? So in some ways, right, there are days and there are situations in which qual is more rigorous than quant. Because if you're speaking, if you're trying to get an understanding of the total addressable market, but you're only speaking to your most passionate users, you're going to miss a whole lot of what's actually happening, right? And so I think part of it might be that, especially on the quantitative side, we can get very academic and we can get very into the weeds in terms of what we're doing. And that shuts people out, right? They stop listening.
Yeah.
And we're there just being like, let me tell you about the theory and why this would make sense and why it is that this is potentially problematic, or why you need to consider alternatives in terms of understanding your user population. So I think, we get both like overly rigorous at times or overly academic, and then we'll often also get into a place of being overly simplistic, and then we get ourselves into trouble, right? And organizations and cross-functional partners are like, okay, what's my takeaway? And as researchers, right, we're often like, well, it depends. Here are the conditions under which this would be true, and here are the conditions under which it would not be true. That's when we get that overly academic orientation. But then sometimes you have somebody who spoke to 5 individuals and comes out incredibly confident, and the product ends up not being successful based on the back of not enough information. I think both of those things get us into a whole lot of trouble in terms of being compelling and convincing stakeholders that we are bringing value to the table. So it's like, how do you navigate these things in order to be effective?
Hmm. I mean, return on investment's always a big thing as well in the research world. And like how frequently do you or have you seen people actually doing, say, a year in review? So we helped with these projects this year, and this is the outcomes at each scene. This is what we did 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So just following those along.
Yeah, I think more mature organizations are doing that really well.
Hmm.
Um, Especially more mature research organizations. To shout out my former team and employer at Instagram, partially research is its own function, which means it's automatically respected in the room in a way that it often isn't in other situations. And there's a team orientation towards like understanding that research is actually going to help with the future roadmap, right? And that research is 2, 6, 12 months ahead of product and is really helping to lay the groundwork for work that, for product that needs to be developed moving forward or opportunities moving forward. Um, and and there's a system and process in place to make sure that every time you're in a review cycle, every time you're thinking about road mapping, that product is, every potential product is has a foundation of research there. And so you can have that look back and really pretty confidently say, like, we've got this fully tracked all the way through. But most places aren't like that. And then it's on the individual researcher and a small team and a smaller org to make sure that they're consistently chasing that down so that they can have that deck at the end of the year of a year in review to show, like, listen, because of the work that we have done over the course of the past year, these are the changes that have been made and are, in the future coming roadmaps.
And they often stack up quite quickly as well. But it's only once you start writing them down and noting them that you actually see, like, wow, we actually achieved quite a bit more than we thought collectively.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, this is one of the things where it's like, how do you get all of that information collated? And one of the problems that a lot of us get into is that you get to December 1 and you're like, okay, time to make that deck, right? And now you're like, our memories are garbage. We're reaching back in 12 months prior and thinking, like, what did we do? How did that impact things? And I think it's really important. I have what I call my garbage doc. And
Yeah.
it's just a Word doc that as evidence comes through of my work impacting anything, I I just dump it in there. It's not organized. It's not, there are probably much better systems, but it means at the end of the year, I open it up and it's all there. I then have to organize it
Yeah.
and put it all together, but it also allows me to move really fast. So I can literally take a screenshot of somebody's Slack to me about saying, because of this work, we ended up going in this direction. I just drop it in there and then I can go through by date. It's at least organized by date.
Yeah.
And be able to put that together. And I think that's where a lot of us, it's like just having that garbage doc can save you so much time and effort. And then you can go back to that person and say, we worked on this. Can you tell me how did it actually change things? I think that's the other piece, is being really proactive and talking to your cross-functional partners and asking them,
Yes.
I
No,
did this
good.
work with you. How did it change things?
Mm. Yeah, and I'd love to hear. I mean, people always love hearing about that, don't they? They want success stories, and it just makes you feel good yourself, as a researcher. But then also you can start sharing that with leadership as well, just saying, "Hey, look, we've been able to do all of this and need to hear."
Yeah.
Um,
I think one of the biggest mistakes that I think all people get caught up in, and certainly researchers, is not doing the work to advocate for yourself. Kind of saying, I know I'm doing good work and my good work should be noticed, which, like, what an amazing world it would be if all of us could just put our heads down and be recognized for the good work that we are doing without having to self-advocate. It's just not the world we live in. And it's taken me a long time to realize that I can't just be like, but look how hard I worked. I worked so hard. Can't you see that I worked so hard? And it's like, well, no, you actually have to, you know, market yourself and through the process of saying, hey, how did I influence change in your product or in your roadmap? That's very helpful. That can be really challenging for people. But I think also saying, I've done this relatively recently where I conducted some research. One of our product directors asked if they could use some, like, early analysis to share with our CEO. And I was like, absolutely. But by the way, will you mind just letting them know that it was the research team that did this work? You know, and that was it was hard to do, right? It was that moment of like, okay, no, I need to make sure that our work is being recognized out across the organization. And I can't be mad when I see my work being presented without it being attributed to me or to our larger team. Or rather, I can be mad, but then I need to do something about it. And
Mm,
that something isn't to get mad at everybody else, but it's to say, like, hey, when you're sharing my work, mind just making sure that my name is on the slide or just like mention that I'm the one who conducted it. Because it's in my best interest and in everybody's best interest that you all understand that we are useful members of the team
that's right.
that are providing value.
Yeah, well, to everyone out there, like awesome work on all of the value that you do bring to your companies. So, thanks from us at least.
Yeah.
So, your experience in, I guess, helping researchers to sell into uh, leadership has led you to develop a sort of framework for gaining stakeholder support. Can you walk us through the key steps of that?
Yes, yes. So this is kind of a funny one because I didn't realize that I had a system until until people started asking me in public settings that like how do you get that buy-in? I think there are a number of different things that you need to do, and it's not necessarily linear because we are going to be in different types of rooms, and different types of stakeholders require different things. But one of the first things that I do, especially when I'm in a new organization, new team, new cross-functional partner, is take the time to get to know them. It feels so small and simple and obvious. And I think we're often told, like, you gotta build relationships, but we're hitting the ground running and we're not actually doing the work to build trust outside of our expertise. We all know that, like, if somebody likes and trusts you, they're more likely to listen to you. So it's making sure that you've actually taken the time to get to know your stakeholders. When I first started at Apple, I was meeting so many people, I was getting really overwhelmed. And I actually kept a spreadsheet where I would, every time I met with somebody, I would put their name, any information I found out about them, how many kids they had, do they have a dog, do they like to climb mountains, do they, whatever it might be, I would just have this spreadsheet so that next time I saw them, I could holler back to something personal,
Mm,
get that personal connection. It's not easy, right? It's hard to remember all of these different things, but it's really, really helpful in
yeah.
the grand scheme of things to use people's names, ask them about about how they are and who they are. So that's step one. You gotta get to know the people that you're dealing with. Step number two, figure out who the most difficult person in the room is. You gotta do it. It's so painful. It's so painful. And then, and this is gonna sound a bit silly, make them laugh. Find a way to get them to smile and laugh because once you've got them there, like you've got them and they're gonna listen. Right. So like that's the number two. I think number three is always have time and space to educate. Right. So I've mentioned earlier, it's shocking to me how many times I've been in situations where I'm like, correlation is not causation. I could I could say that, right? I could be like, come on, guys, correlation is not causation. And then half the room would be like, yeah, right, dummies over there keep thinking correlation is the same as causation. But now I've alienated the other half of the room, right? I've made them feel uncomfortable or stupid. They don't really understand what the difference is.
Mm,
And and now I've got myself a bigger problem because now there's a fence up and they don't understand the most like critical foundational piece of information of what I'm trying to communicate. So
mm,
part of that building relationships is having the time and space to educate, not in a condescending way, not in a patronizing way, but in a really honest recognition of the fact that you have expertise and they have expertise and those expertise are different. So wanting to make sure that you always take the time to educate in a really thoughtful way, right? Following up with somebody, paying attention to your room, right? So you look around the room, and this is partially just being a strong presenter or communicator.
Mm.
When you speak, look around the room. What are people's faces? What do they look like, right? Are they grimacing? Are they on their phone? What's happening? Because it's a really strong signal about whether or not they're paying attention, whether or not they care, and whether or not they're buying what you're selling. Right. And so really paying attention to that, I think, is incredibly critical so that you can figure out who your allies are in the room. I never go into a room at this point. Oh, not never say never. I rarely go into a room without confidence that I have several allies in the room. Right. By finding that grumpiest, most difficult individual in the room and getting them on your side, you will get buy-in from the rest of the room because they all know that that individual is the grumpiest, most difficult person in the room. And then they're like, what kind of magic has happened here that you have them on your side? So I think that allyship, that building trust, that allyship is really critical. And I think we are inclined to say that grumpiest, most miserable, difficult person in the room, I don't want to deal with them. They suck. And it's like, no, 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 no. They're actually your key. If you can get them, you've got everybody else. I think the other thing is to truly know your craft, right? So, and this is a tough one to tell people, especially if they're coming up, but find the smartest person in the room, go toe to toe to them. Not in a rude, condescending way, but go toe to toe. Show them that you know what you're talking about, right? Make it really clear that you have a deep understanding of your craft.
Mm.
Again, not in a defensive way, not in a condescending way, but making it clear like, listen, you have unique expertise, right? You're an engineer. I am not an engineer. I am not going to tell you how to do your job. I have the deepest, utmost respect for everything that you do. Unfortunately, you don't seem to be giving me the same. So I just need to, at some point, go toe to toe,
Mm.
really show that I know my craft. And that also goes back into that educating piece. And that's so hard. It's so hard, right? Because a lot of us get nervous and in that moment, and then afterwards you think about all the brilliant things you should have said or could have said. Write those down and go back to that individual,
Mm.
right? It's that super painful work. It's all ultimately about relationship building.
Yeah.
But I think it's really, really incredibly critical in order to get that buy-in. So that's I mean, in terms of, is it exactly a framework? It's not linear, but it is like slowly but surely peeling people off and getting them on your side. I, no joke, had a get to know you one-on-one with a product manager years ago. First time we ever talked, we were yelling at each other halfway through this conversation. I've never been in a situation that was so strangely combative. And my intention was just to be like, hey, I'm the new researcher in town. And she was incredibly combative. It was a really challenging interaction. It was so bad, I stopped off on the phone as what's happening and why I want to stop what this interaction is and regroup. And I just called it out. Right. I didn't hang up and say, what a horrible person. I don't want to deal with her. I didn't run into somebody else. What a horrible person she is. I don't want to deal with her. Researcher at the end of the day, right? And I focus on human behavior. What am I not understanding about this individual that is driving us to get to a point where we're like this contentious?
Mm.
And then I did the really brutal work of figuring that out, right? Of talking to her, trying to understand, backing way up, like not throwing recognizing that throwing my expertise in her face was not a winning solution. How do I actually get to an understanding of what it is that she's uncomfortable with? Turns out, right, it was more like a being threatened sort of situation. And I needed to understand that and I needed to adjust. When I tell you she's one of my favorite people now, I am legitimately being honest, but she's tough.
Mm.
and she's tough to navigate, but like she's brilliant and she's strong-headed, and I just needed to figure that. I needed to like figure out how to get her on my side, and it took way more time than it takes me for other individuals, and it was so worth it because when I walked into a room and she was in there and she was an ally, everybody was like, "Hold up, you have her?
Mm.
Well, listen, now we're here. Now we'll pay attention." And kind of understanding those dynamics, I think, is really critical and a unique superpower that researchers of human behavior, I think, get to have, right? That is part of our job, is to really understand how people think and feel and act, and then hopefully use it to our advantage to get stakeholder buy-in.
That's right. And doing that confrontation or dealing with that conflict is a lot easier in person as well, isn't it, than digitally online?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm.
Absolutely. I think, doing the work to seek people out one-on-one and having real human interactions is really, really important. I think a lot of times, I know I misread things on Slack. I think everybody else does, or an email. And if I feel myself getting a little like hot under the collar, I ask for, let's get on a call.
Yeah.
Right. Like what am I missing? What am I misunderstanding?
So
And
I
most of the
think
time, I don't understand you. Sorry. It's just
no,
that
no,
people
no,
are understanding you, right? And you're like, okay, so I need to adjust how I'm talking about this topic.
absolutely.
Understand.
So if we just do a little sidebar here, an education piece, because you said it's so important. What is the best way to explain to someone the difference between correlation and causation and why they don't match?
That's such a good question, because when that comes up and it's a very capable adult who who is conflating that,
Mm.
um, the last thing you want to do is kind of give them, the old, um, um, kind of the old examples of like ice cream and summertime and people dying, right? Like more people eat ice cream and die at the same time. And what's the issue? Is that it's summertime and they're at a pool, right?
Yeah.
And it's the pool that's killing them, not the ice cream, right? So doing that sort of exercise doesn't go over well. Great in a classroom to undergrads to kind of walk through some of those classic examples. Um, but I think it's being really um, kind and explaining through process, right? So something like, let's say you find a relationship, between, you see some sort of an actual statistical correlation between X and Y. And somebody says, great, if X drives Y, then like let's pull on that X lever. And then saying, hey, we don't know for certain that X actually leads to Y. We just see that they have a strong relationship. So before we pull on X, let's think about what other things might be leading to Y. By the way, I have a model or whatever it is that I might be doing where I see a lot of different things have a relationship to why. We don't know which of these things might actually have a causal path. We just know that there's a relationship here. So if we want to move forward on this, like we might want to design like an experiment, something that we can cleanly identify this as a causal path, but just don't treat them as though they don't understand.
Yeah.
Treat them as though they do understand, but through that explanation, explain why this, you can't just pull the lever for X to get Y.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a tough one for a lot of people to do, right? And to navigate. But I think it's because you're just not thinking about like have the explanation and the education in the conversation in such a way that the person doesn't they're being educated.
Mm. And it's a confidence, isn't it? So
Yeah.
there is a correlation, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I even take away, especially when you get like correlation, causation language, I take away those words.
For sure.
Because again, everyone's like, I know the difference, right? Like virtually every adult you'll run across in business is going to say, of course I know the difference. And it's like, okay, fine. Let's not use those words.
Yep.
Let's use adjacent words that mean the same thing. That again, remove the like tension of me saying, "Hey, you don't know what you're talking about." That is the last thing that you want to do as a researcher trying to get buy-in, right? You want to make sure to like, "Hey, I'm just gonna educate through our conversation." And then oftentimes you end up educating the rest of the room too, right? So like anything, it's probably not just that person who doesn't fully understand what this is.
Mm. So, if there are researchers out there that in organizations that undervalue research, what's what steps should they take to start building that credibility and trust?
So it's the long, slow relationship building without a doubt, right? So I think if you are an individual at an organization where you have been brought in to conduct research, but you really don't feel organizational buy-in, somebody somewhere believed that you should be there, right? Or else you wouldn't have been hired. So first of all, finding that person, right? And then working through it. I think that a lot of times, again, we're not taking the time to get people on board one-on-one. And then we're not really understanding what the pushback is. Like where is what's the underlying issue in terms of why you aren't being valued or the work isn't being seen as critical. And then it's a little bit of, showing value through the work that you do, right? So being able to run a research project, get that cross-functional buy-in, and then make sure that you are part of the story that's being communicated to leadership. And I think that's another one where I was saying, like, if your work is being included in a doc, you can be mad that you weren't, the work wasn't attributed to you. Be annoyed, call a friend, tell them how annoyed you are, and then go back to the team and the next thing you do, ask. Just be clear about what you need, right? Can you please, include me in the meeting? Um, you know, uh, Attribute the work to me, of course, all in ways that aren't attacking or aggressive, because that can be really challenging, I think, especially for researchers in an organization where research isn't necessarily valued. But I think getting to that point is really critical. One of the things that I like to do is make sure that anytime I am presenting or going through work that I do, shouting out anybody who helped in any way. I have an engineering partner who helps me put surveys out on platform. I call out his name every single time I speak to the work. Right. He's very much on the background. He has nothing to do with the work itself, but
Mm.
without him, I'm not getting that, those surveys out to the population that I need them to be. So like making sure to like if you feel like you're not getting um your work properly attributed, then make sure that anytime you are out there, you are attributing everybody around you. Because obviously that builds goodwill, but it's also the right thing to do.
Mm.
And then when you turn around and say, hey, can you make sure that my name's on that doc or that I am a part of this conversation? People are like, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, right? I really appreciate that you put my name out there when you were off, presenting your work too. And that also helps with larger buy-in, right? Because you're getting your direct peers on board, right? They feel like they can trust you and that you're bringing value to them. At the end of the day, right? We're all seeking good review cycles and promotions and all these sorts of things. And so, like, make sure that you're giving at the same level as you expect to get, right? I mean, it's a little bit silly and reductive to talk about the golden rule, but that's kind of That's kind of the reality, right? Like, make sure you're giving out the accolades that you would like to see coming at you,
Mm,
and then go out and advocate for yourself. Best not to do it before you've actually done all of that relationship building and making sure that you are really clearly supporting all of your peers. Um, you got to build up a little bit of that goodwill, and it's going to take time. I think the other thing that I see a lot of people getting frustrated with is like they want one meeting to lead to everything. And it's like, this takes time.
mm,
Right? You have to spend a long time building relationships, and you might get 3 years in and realize, like, still more relationships to build. And like, you just gotta keep moving forward. And I think that's something that's really hard. Again, everybody's like, but I'm doing good work. Why, why don't you care about what I'm doing? It's like, well, you have to do good work. Then you have to make sure that your peers value that work before you can expect that leadership is going to see that what you're doing is valuable to the larger organization.
no, some good points there. What excites you most about the future of research and its role in driving strategic decisions?
What excites me? I'm excited for more people, more companies, more organizations to understand the value of research. Like I said, I think in some places it's still relatively nascent, and there's lots of opportunity to grow the field and really understand how critical it is in the process. Um, I also think uh, having expertise in understanding people is um is also something that AI can't necessarily get. And so I am hopeful that technologies like AI can help us be more productive, but that we still have a unique skill set in understanding consumers and end users, and really getting companies to understand like what the benefit of deeply understanding your people, right? The people, your end users is. What I've found over the years is that my quant skills give me that they get me into the room, right? Because they're like, scale, statistics, we love it. But it's the personal stories that are brought in that actually, like, once you have that buy-in and then you bring in the personal stories that can really like knock the socks off of your leadership in terms of really feeling how that end user feels, and getting them to really understand that end user. And I hope that we will continue to have a user focused lens in the products that we are building, and that researchers are a little bit the first line of defense, right? And raising flags about concerns about safety or mental health or anything like that. Like, we are in a really unique position. Um, and so I hope to see us strengthen in the future so that we can make sure to keep our end user not just delighted, but safe and happy and well served.
Very nice. Before we wrap, were any final points that you wanted to share on our topic today, market research in an age of skepticism?
Any final points? I think one of the I think it's back, that I really can't hammer the relationship aspect enough, right? But because of that, you also need to think about um, finding mentors. I think one of the things that I tell people often is, I get people reaching out to me asking for mentorship. And I'm like, I'm not going to be a great mentor for you because I am just at a point in my career that I don't know what it feels like to be you anymore. Right? Like, if you're, just starting out in your career, I don't when I had those feelings, it was a long time ago at this point. You want to find somebody who is 3 to 5 years ahead of you because they can still remember what
Mm,
it was like 3 to 5 years ago. And they're much more able to like help you on the path moving forward. Because they're just closer to your experience. And I think that identifying those mentors, I think, is really, really important. Um, and making sure that they're the right ones, because I think a lot of times it's like you're a junior researcher and you reach out to like the VP and say, "Can you be my mentor?" And of course that person wants to help and be supportive, but at the end of the day, there's just too big of a gap.
yeah.
So like, find mentors that are a little bit closer to where you are because they're much more capable of laying out the path for you on how to get to where they are in the
Mm.
next 3 to.
Do you also flip that as well? Find a mentee?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think absolutely, right? I think it's our responsibility, especially in when we are in a field that is, maybe has a lot of skepticism around it, right? To make sure that you're always throwing a ladder down
Mm.
to help people up, right? And so I think absolutely. There's no world in which that's not true, right? Like you always have to be if you want to see the field of research grow and influence, you can't be all alone at the top. You have to bring people with you.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a really fascinating discussion today, Lauren. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. It's really, really, really fun to do this.
Yes. And to our listeners out there, thank you as well for listening in. If you have enjoyed what you've heard today, feel free to share it with someone else who might find it equally as challenging and interesting as well. There's lots of little gems throughout it. We'd also appreciate a subscribe and a review if you do have the time. So until next time, thanks for listening to Now That's Significant.